Hi everyone, Professor King here. In this video, I'm going to give you some tips on how to read Native Country of the Heart by Cherry Moraga. These should help in terms of synthesizing some of the information we've already learned throughout the English 100 classroom, but in a larger scale because this is a whole book as a text, not just an article or something like that. So I've drawn up a page of notes that I'll be going over shortly. But remember, if any questions arise, please feel free to contact me via Canvas messaging or email, or you can visit my Zoom office hours. But without further ado, let's just go straight into this discussion. I'll take it to a share screen here. We have my notes here. I'll just make this page as large as possible. Okay, and I'll zoom in a little bit so that you can see better on your computer screens. So reading tips for English 100. Again, if you've been following along with a lot of the web teaches that coincide with the Norton textbook readings, a lot of this should be review for you, but review is always helpful when we're learning to make sure that we're doing what we need to do in order to fully grasp a text, not just grapple with it, but be able to utilize it in some significant way, which is what we're going to need to do for both the annotated bibliography and for the final essay. And I'll talk about those briefly in this video and to a greater extent in other upcoming videos. So what are some reading tips for this class? Well, I'll give you a little background story. I may have told this story before, but I remember when I was in college, I had a classmate who, he loved reading, but it took him a long time. And he was always sort of fascinated by the fact that I was an English major. We were both in an English class, but he wasn't necessarily an English major. And so he asked me one day, how do I read quickly? And I think he was kind of referencing some of these, at the time, they were more of like these infomercial type things. Now they'd probably be like on an app or in an ad on Instagram or something. But they taught people how to speed read. And the idea was you could read like a page in 60 seconds if you just learned how to speed read. And ultimately what they sold was a hill of beans, right? Like it wasn't, it wasn't valuable, because if their strategy worked, we'd all be speed reading. But in reality, reading actually takes a lot of time. It's a slow going process. It's a contemplative process. It's a process that involves reading, having sort of multiple windows or books open at one time. And I'll talk about that in a sec. So we have to honor that process and not try and speed up too quickly, because I don't know about you, but I know when I read quickly, I start to really lose focus on what I'm reading. Sometimes the grocery list goes on in the back of my mind. Sometimes I'm just not processing. And so that's when I know I have to kind of put the book down. And as I've mentioned in other videos, maybe take a break, come back to it, whatever I have to do. So in other words, while you're reading, give yourselves time, slow down, let the ideas marinate. And as you're reading, you should be highlighting, annotating, maybe even dictating into a phone, if that's easier for you. But you should be analyzing what you read, constantly asking why. There's a great quote that Moraga shares in here where she talks about Martin Luther King and sort of this idea of the skeptic. And I don't know if I've earmarked it. I thought I did. But she essentially says, like this life as the skeptic is necessary. To be someone who is constantly questioning is the person who is going to not only move herself forward, but move forward, the long arc of justice throughout history or what have you. And so we have to keep this healthy skepticism as we read, or at least we have to ask why. Why is Moraga writing this memoir? Why is she talking about her mother in the way that she is? Why is she talking about her father in the way that she is? What is she setting up in terms of discussing this in a historical or generational context where we're kind of moving through the text chronologically? Whatever you encounter where you have to ask why, ask it and contemplate it, think about it. Always keep in mind the rhetorical triangle, and I have an image of that here for those of you who need reference. The rhetorical triangle considers not just the text itself, the message in the middle here, but it also considers the author, the creator of that text, the audience for whom they may have written that text, and their purpose in writing it. And keep in mind, we've talked about the rhetorical triangle before, but when one of these elements changes, the whole thing changes, right? If I'm writing a text message to my grandma about what I did this weekend, my purpose is going to be very different than if I'm writing a text message to my best friend about what we got into this weekend, right? That's going to change the message. It's going to change the purpose just by changing the audience, right? And it's even going to change the way that I speak, how I craft the message itself. So keep that in mind as you're reading this novel. Again, who is Cherry Moraga? Why is she telling us this narrative? Who is her audience? And again, we can't say everyone, that's too broad. If this particular group is her audience, then why is she telling her audience that? As you're reading, so that's kind of like more broad approach to the text. Now, the day-to-day approach to the text, as you're reading, chapter in and chapter out of this, as you're reading, you should be doing a couple of things at the sentence level to make sure not only that you're understanding what she's saying, but that you're finding valuable information upon which that you can then analyze, postulate, apply ideas, et cetera, et cetera. So as I've mentioned before, when you encounter unfamiliar words, you'll want to maybe put a box around them and then pull up your, just your Google definition or your dictionary, what have you, anything that can provide a definition of that term, and then reread it in context. Then after you've boxed it, defined it, reread it in context, and if there's something you want to say about that passage, write notes in the margins, highlight important golden lines, words or phrases, and annotate your reactions. And an annotation can be as simple as like a smiley face, a star, a question mark, a frowny face, whatever your sort of initial visceral reaction to this is. And as I mentioned, you can always voice record ideas if that's faster for you, and the sort of writing or highlighting and annotating may take a little bit longer. I would say grab, my phone's charging in the other room, otherwise I'd use it as a visual. I would say grab your phone, and if you find an important passage, maybe you have a rental and you don't want to highlight through the text, but you want to have the right page numbers at your disposal, you can say, okay, on page 95 is where she gives us this line about the cat, right? The cat and the doctor. This is one of my favorite scenes, like this doctor explaining that like a cat told him his life path, right? So you can just leave a voice memo of yourself, like page 95, doctor with the cat and the life story, right? And then you can record that, and you can keep doing that as you go through the text, if that's an easier way of recording information for you. So that's just kind of the basics. Now let's go to Moraga specifically. The first thing you'll want to do whenever you're sitting down to read this is to pre-read. Think about not just the title of the book, but the title of the chapter. Why did she title that chapter with those words? Maybe she mentions it, maybe it's a reference to something, maybe it's intertextual, check it out. Also look at the length of the piece that you'll have to be writing, and not just the length, but like, look at the font, right? Look at the font size. In previous classes up until this semester, I had a book that was about twice this size, and we got through it in the same amount of time. I wanted to use something a little less dense this time, just so that, again, we can kind of take our time with it. But it's always a good idea, if you've got 30 pages to read, to make sure what those pages look like, because the font in books, as we all know, is going to be different from book to book. And check in with yourself. Again, if you're tired and you know that you only have about 15 to 20 minutes of reading in you for that night, know that. And know that if you read more, you may not absorb all the information. Sometimes, like for me personally, sometimes reading at night is helpful. It helps me fall asleep. Sometimes it's incredibly unhelpful and keeps me up all night, especially if the book generates a lot of ideas. So consider that. If you have a job, it's a great way to wind down in your hour lunch. If you want to, just sort of escape from work environment stuff, you can just bring your book and read then. Whatever works best for you, but check in with yourself physically, emotionally, mentally while you're reading to make sure that you're still absorbing the amount of information you should. Again, if you rented the book or if you have some form of the text that doesn't allow for highlighting or annotating, you can always create, just like this Word document is its own document, you can always create a document or even have a paper document if you want to write down the page numbers and the quotes, where you just transfer those over. People who have online books, this is really helpful because a lot of you can literally just highlight and cut and paste the text. And every time you find a golden line or a strong line or something that may fit for your final essay, the topic you want to research for this, you then have that list of quotes and the page numbers on which they can be found. And that speeds up the writing process for when you're constructing your essay a lot, because you have it all right there to reference. And then again, whenever you encounter an unfamiliar word or phrase or historical happening or name, box it, look it up, do some cursory research. And again, by cursory research, I mean the stuff that's not going into the final essay, the sort of, a quick Google search or a quick Wikipedia that may not be, it may not be to the level of academic research, but at least it helps you contextualize what you're reading. You can do that and then reread in context. Also keep in mind the discussion boards. And keep in mind that we are reading this in preparation for completing an annotated bibliography and a final essay. Now, I want to speak on that a little bit briefly. These are two separate, distinct formal writing assignments, the annotated bibliography, the final research essay. However, they are performed in conjunction with one another. Essentially, what an annotated bibliography is you know those works cited entries on the last page of your essays that I've been having you write? Well, you take the entry itself, then you annotate it. So you summarize what it's all about and you talk about how you might use it in your essay. And you're going to need 4 of those entries, 4 different researched sources for the annotated bibliography for this assignment. So keep that in mind as you're reading, because those sources are then should be transferred over and applied to the argument that you come up with for the final essay. So in other words, the annotated bibliography is it is a formal writing assignment. So it does have to be polished and error-free and MLA formatted and all that. But it's a way of you, the researcher and writer, showing me, the instructor, here's the research I'm doing in preparation for the final essay. Here's what it is. And here's how I'm thinking about applying it. Here's how it might be useful to my overall argument. And then the final essay is where you actually do that, right? You construct the argument, you develop it, you insert the evidence from those sources you researched in your annotated bibliography, and you're good to go. But when we're preparing for those, let's think back to the discussion boards, because these discussion boards are going to help us in terms of idea generation, generating ideas for what we'll ultimately write about in the final essay and what we'll research for the annotated bibliography. So these discussion boards, and I should bullet point this. These discussion boards can be messy, right? So far, if you've seen my feedback on your discussion boards, you don't see a lot of fix this here grammatically, or, fix that sentence fragment. I save that for formal writing. And so the discussion boards are great because they can be messy. They don't have to be perfect understandings of what we're talking about. You're kind of throwing stuff on the wall and seeing what fits. They're meant to be what you come back to when you're considering an idea for a larger essay. So it's not a bad idea to, as we're continuing reading this book, Native Country of the Heart, to review your discussion boards and what you say. And, it's not a bad idea to look at other people's discussion boards and to see what they're saying and how they're responding to your ideas. Think about also what you want to perform research on. Is it going to be something historical? Is it going to be something biographical? Is it going to be intertextual? Is it going to be data driven? We talk about all of those and more in this week's module and in, previous and coming modules. So think about what kind of research, or even perhaps what field you're in, and what type of research would be helpful to you in approaching a text. Maybe you're a big history buff and you want to understand a little bit more about Tijuana in the 1930s and sort of what Vera's upbringing was like. Maybe you are really interested in Southern California culture and the history of Southern California. So talking about Pasadena, Alhambra in the 1960s is something that would interest you, and sort of the historical context of the effect that would have on Cherry Moraga's life. Do you want to know more about Cherry Moraga? You can read, she mentions other texts in this section that she's written. Maybe you could read other works of hers. It's more of a professional biography, right? Maybe you could watch interviews with her to get some of her personal beliefs and apply them to your reading of this text. Think about all of the songs or albums or books or theoretical articles, et cetera, that she mentions in this section, from Camus to Lord to Ansel Dua to whoever, right? Why is she referencing those texts? If you do a little bit of research on the text, what does knowing these ideas from this person contribute to our understanding of Native country of the heart? And data, right? In the same way that history provides us sort of a factual background of what we might be reading from a historical context, so does data, right? Maybe data on the experience of lesbian women of color in the late 20th century. Maybe data on, parenting after 40, whatever kind of speaks to you from this book. And again, use your experience as the fuel for your own research. If you're reading this book and you're like, oh my gosh, this reminds me of X, the purpose of the final research essay is not to tell me your own life story. It's a research essay. It's not a biographical essay. The purpose, however, right? So, sorry, let me backtrack a little bit. So a lot of times when we're doing research, we feel that impetus to talk about ourselves because it's something we care about or are interested and have a stake in. And what I always tell people to do is, before you start talking about yourself, use that personal experience as the fuel for your research. Think about keywords from your own personal life that may apply. Think about historical movements you remember that might apply. Whatever you can think of. And then instead of talking about yourself, allow that to fuel research you do in learning more about the world, more about not just this text, but what's in it, but what is contextualizing it, what's outside of it in terms of history, biography, other texts, current events, etc. And then keep in mind the selected bibliography on page 239 of this book, not of the Norton book. I want to show you this, and I'm going to kind of do my best. If you look here at this selected bibliography on page 239 of Native Country of the Heart, it should look very familiar to you in that it looks like a works cited page. And that's exactly, well, almost exactly what it is. Not all of these are cited directly in the text, but they're referenced, and they're what Moraga used to research her own self. She's looking at herself and her memoir as a text, and these are kind of what helped her to contextualize that. So if you're stuck on a place to research, this is a great place to start, to do some cursory research on some of these entries, these research sources, and then say, is that something that I could sink my teeth further into and go from there? That's why we have bibliographies and works cited pages. When we're younger, we think it's because of our teacher has to check for plagiarism, but really what it is when you get to the higher and higher levels of research and education, it's so that when other people are reading your text, that they can have a frame of reference of the types of sources you used or you studied when you were crafting that text, so then they can go and perform that same research and more research in addition to that. And then finally, remember that writing doesn't need to be perfect, right? Until you hand in the final draft. The final draft of your essay, again, should be error-free, properly formatted, hitting the page length, all the things. But as you're drafting, until you get to that final moment, focus less on perfection and more on creativity, uniqueness, cleverness of your argument until you get there. You know, do the revising, the proofreading, the reorganizing, the taking out, the putting in, the adding analysis. Save a lot of that for the very end when you have kind of the working bones of your essay. But make sure to do it. You can't, you can't hand in a non-edited essay full of errors unless you want that to affect your overall grade negatively. So keep all this in mind as you're reading. All right, I'm going to take it off stop share now. I hope that this was helpful in terms of contextualizing how to approach this book a little, and in a way that's a little more helpful. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to email or Zoom or Canvas message me. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day and week. All right, thanks.